If you want to know why healthcare costs so much in this country, consider this. It's estimated that $210 billion a year, about 10% of all health expenditures, goes towards unnecessary tests and treatments, and a big chunk of that comes right out of the pockets of American taxpayers in the form of Medicare and Medicaid payments. For more than a year, we have been looking into the admission and billing practices of Health Management Associates. It's the fourth largest for-profit hospital chain in the country, with revenues of $5.8 billion last year, and nearly half of that coming from Medicare and Medicaid programs. We talked to more than 100 current and former employees, and we heard a similar story over and over, that HMA relentlessly pressured its doctors to admit more and more patients, regardless of medical need, in order to increase revenues. Health Management Associates owns 70 hospitals in 15 states. It's thrived buying small, struggling hospitals in non-urban areas, turning them into profit centers by filling empty beds. Generally speaking, the more patients a hospital admits, the more money it can make, a business strategy that HMA has aggressively pursued. Did you feel the hospital was putting pressure on doctors to admit people?
Yes.
For what reason?
Money.
You're sure of that?
Mm-hmm.
Until she was fired, Nancy Alford was the director of case management at the HMA hospital in Mesquite, Texas, where she oversaw the auditing of patient records and signed off on the accuracy of bills sent to Medicare and Medicaid. She'd never met former HMA doctors Jeff Hamby, Cliff Clunan, and Scott Rankin until we brought them together in New York to discuss their experiences at HMA.
What's really remarkable is we're from very different areas of the country, yet the pressures placed upon the emergency physicians and the mechanism in place to enforce those procedures and policies exactly the same.
Cliff Clunan is a retired colonel who spent 21 years as an Army doctor before joining the Carlisle Regional Medical Center in Pennsylvania as the Assistant Emergency Room Director. Dr. Scott Rankin worked in the same department. Both say they were told by HMA and its ER staffing contractor, MCare, that if they didn't start admitting more patients to the hospital, they would lose their jobs.
My department chief said, we will admit 20% of our patients or somebody's going to get fired.
What's wrong with admitting 20%?
In a relatively rural, limited resource community hospital, your admission rate out of the emergency department somewhere in the neighborhood of 10%.
And they wanted 20.
Correct. They wanted 20.
There's no way that you can do that and not have it be fraudulent, because you're not admitting on the basis of medical requirements. You're basing it on strictly an arbitrary number that has been pulled out.
All sorts of businesses set quotas. What's wrong with this?
We're not building widgets. We're taking care of patients who are ill and come into the emergency department.
Jeff Hamby was an emergency room doctor at HMA's Summit Medical Center in northwest Arkansas. He says he was fired for not meeting admission targets and is suing HMA for wrongful termination. HMA maintains no one has ever been fired over admission numbers. Hamby called the targets, quote, coercion to commit fraud.
Initially it was 15%. They kept trying to up it.
They didn't care how you got there, they just wanted you to...
Wanted us to hit the benchmark. Arbitrary benchmark.
They're saying you will admit these people whether they're sick or not, whether they need to be hospitalized.
Correct.
They never phrase it that way. They did say admit 20%. The reality of that is that there's only one way that that can happen, and that is if it is arbitrary. That is, if you do admit patients that don't need to be admitted.
For patients who are 65 and over, the benchmark was 50%.
Those would be Medicare patients.
Correct.
And you're saying it's not a good idea to admit half the patients over 65?
If you are put into the hospital for reasons other than a good justifiable medical reason, it puts you at significant risk for hospital-acquired infections and what we would refer to as medical misadventures.
These stories are echoed in many of the thousands of documents we examined, including emails like this one from a hospital executive in Durant, Oklahoma, pressuring her staff during emergency room shifts. Quote, only 14 admits so far. Act accordingly. And this email from an ER director at an HMA hospital in South Carolina to a new emergency room doctor. Quote, Every time a 65-year-old or older comes in, I'm already thinking, do they have some condition I can admit them for? We are under constant scrutiny. I'll be blunt. I've been told to replace you if your numbers do not improve.
In your dealings with HMA, did you ever get any sense that this was commercially driven?
Of course. I can imagine any other explanation to admit a percentage.
The administrators said that daily, frequently. You know, we don't make any money if we do this. We make more money if we do that.
Admit more patients?
Admit more patients, keep them longer. Money was the chief motivator.
You're all saying this was codified, institutionalized at HMA.
Absolutely. This was a well thought out plan. And it even relates to how they had control over us as emergency physicians.
That control, they say, was exerted with corporate-wide computer software called ProMed, which was installed in every emergency room. HMA says it was designed and approved by medical experts to improve the quality of patient care. But doctors, nurses, emergency room directors, and hospital administrators told us that HMA customized the program to automatically order an extensive battery of tests, many of them unnecessary, as soon as a patient walked into the emergency room.
The minute the chief complaint and their age was placed into that computer, that system ordered a battery of tests that was already predetermined.
And this was prior to being seen by the treating physician. And we would look at the chart and say, why was all this ordered?
The computer program also generated printed reports like this one, evaluating each doctor's performance and productivity. On this document, the doctors who hit corporate admission goals received praise from company managers. Those who didn't knew it.
The primary purpose of the scorecard was to track how you were doing in terms of revenue generation based on number of tests ordered and number of patients admitted to the hospital.
It has nothing to do with patient safety and patient care. It has everything to do with generating revenues.
They say that when a doctor decided to send an emergency room patient home, the computer would often intervene, prompting the doctor to reconsider.
The minute I hit home, it says qual check, and then it comes up with a warning. This patient meets criteria for admission. Do you want to override?
What was the reaction from the administrators if you overrode the computer?
It was like being called to the principal's office.
Mind you, this is coming from a non-physician, somebody who never went to medical school, never did a residency, frankly has never seen or treated a patient, is telling a physician how they should be taking care of a patient and making decisions related to a patient. I mean, my blood pressure is going up just saying this.
In August, a former executive vice president of the hospital chain, John Vollmer, testified under oath in a deposition that HMA's aggressive admission policies came directly from the top, CEO Gary Newsom.
Mr. Newsom's thought was that an average of 16% was accomplishable at all hospitals or more, and we should seek to do that and make that happen.
Vollmer, who was also fired by HMA, became angry when the company lawyers challenged him.
I did my duty by informing HMA that what they're doing is wrong. They can't require them all to have 16% admission rates and beat up doctors and administrators and all these folks over it when you're doing it to increase your revenue.
I'm going to move to strike what you just said.
We wanted to talk with Gary Newsom, Health Management Associates CEO, but instead we were given HMA Executive Vice President Alan Levine, who joined the company just 2 years ago. Levine says the allegations are coming from disgruntled employees, and if they were true, he said, it would be reflected in the admissions data. He says admission rates haven't changed in 4 years and are near or below industry averages.
The allegation has to do with you taking people who shouldn't be admitted to the hospital and putting them in the hospital.
Those allegations are absolutely wrong.
HMA doesn't set quotas for hospital admissions.
No.
HMA never told emergency rooms that they needed to admit a certain percentage of people that came in.
We tell them collaboratively that our goal is to make sure the patient gets in the right setting. We don't want a patient going home that should be admitted. We don't want a patient admitted that shouldn't be admitted.
I've got some documents here from Durant, Oklahoma.
We showed Levine this physician performance review from the HMA hospital in Durant, Oklahoma, which had been given to us by a doctor there.
It prominently shows an admission goal of 20%. It says there on the right-hand side, goal, 20%. And it shows the lights, the reds show people who are not actually meeting their goal.
Well, first of all, I've never seen this document, so I can't, I mean, I can tell you right now, as a company, there's a lot of things on this form, Steve. We look at testing guidelines. There's a lot of quality metrics on here, Steve. We measure all of this stuff.
We have here one whole column, goal.
That's not
goal.
That's not from our company, Steve. I don't know where that came from.
It's not from your company. It's from one of your hospitals.
Steve, we don't have any kind of goals. I don't know what the percent admissions are in that hospital. Maybe they're actually 20%. But the admissions goal at any hospital is driven only by what the normal trend is for that hospital.
We've talked to 100 people who say that there was pressure from the corporate level to admit people. Are they all lying?
Steve, we have one goal, and I'm not going to judge anybody else. Our goal is each and every patient that comes into the hospital is a unique and special circumstance.
Hardly anyone we talked to complained about the quality of care at HMA hospitals, only the quantity of care. And we were not the first to raise the subject of inappropriate admissions with corporate executives. Paul Meier raised the allegation several years ago. At the time, he was director of compliance with HMA, charged with inspecting and auditing its hospitals to make sure they were following state and federal laws. Meier is a former 30-year veteran of the FBI whose last assignment had been supervising Medicare fraud in Miami before he joined HMA. HMA has said that their admission policies are designed to improve the quality of care for the patients. Do you believe that?
Based on my experience, I can't believe it.
What do you think they're based on?
I think they're based on profit.
Meier says he reached that conclusion in 2010 after hearing complaints from emergency room doctors, caseworkers, and hospital administrators. They said they were being pressured to fill beds with people who did not need to be admitted to the hospital. Meier says he audited 4 hospitals in Texas, Florida, and Oklahoma and concluded that HMA had intentionally billed Medicare and Medicaid for hundreds of thousands of dollars in inappropriate hospital stays that did not meet government standards for admission or reimbursement. Did you think it was Medicare fraud?
Yes. There was Medicare fraud. Simple as that.
Why was it Medicare fraud?
They're submitting bills to the government for the admission of patients. The patients didn't meet the appropriate prescribed criteria for admission and for the hospitals to bill Medicare for the admissions. It's a false billing, if you will.
If you'd been at the FBI and somebody came in and handed you all of this stuff, would you have pursued a criminal investigation?
Yes, no doubt about it.
Meier said he told the same thing to corporate officials and wrote up his findings in 3 memos to top management.
I made sure that I spoke with the CEO face-to-face about this, that something is really, really wrong and it's got to be addressed. And I had indicated if it's not addressed by you all, then I'll have to handle it getting addressed by the government.
What was the response?
I had another job change.
Meier says HMA corporate attorneys heavily edited his reports and instructed him to destroy the original version of his memos, but he never did.
I felt it was evidence. These people are changing my write-up of what I found, softening it up, excising out things, labeling it as attorney-client privilege when it wasn't, and I felt certain they're trying to cover this up.
He was eventually fired and is now suing HMA for wrongful termination. What are we supposed to make of these allegations that have been raised by Paul Meier? He says this company's guilty of Medicare fraud.
Well, we'll let the proper authorities be the judge of that. Okay, we feel that we are doing the right thing for our patients. It's not Mr. Meier's place to decide guilt or innocence. We investigate anything that's reported, and if we find a problem, we fix it.
Are you saying that Paul Meier doesn't recognize Medicare fraud when he sees it?
I think his assertions were not accurate. I think he provided incomplete information in the course of doing his own investigations. But at the end of the day, I'm not going to question Mr. Meier.
Our goal is to get it right.
HMA says it hired an outside law firm to investigate Myers' allegations and that there was no finding that would support an allegation of fraud, adding that any overpayments from Medicare and Medicaid were rectified. But Paul Meier is the least of HMA's problems right now. The hospital chain is currently under investigation by the Justice Department, which has subpoenaed records pertaining to the management of its emergency rooms and its computer software program, ProMed, which HMA has stopped using. The hospital chain says it's cooperating fully with the investigation and has nothing to hide.
Tonight we're keeping them honest with an example of just how much money can be made treating sick Americans in downtown Denver. A company called DaVita just moved into this brand new $101 million office tower, complete with fountains, gardens, even a suspended ski gondola inside for private meetings. So what does DaVita do? It runs 2,000 dialysis clinics across the United States, and that has added up to a $7 billion business. A dialysis empire run by a guy who dresses like one of the Three Musketeers, lives by his company's slogan, all for one and one for all, and in company staff meetings leads his employees, who he calls villagers, in cheers.
Now, yo, DaVita! It's so good to get out of that CEO costume and back in my regular clothes.
Ken Thiry is his name, and with an estimated $15 million a year, the Wall Street Journal says he's the best compensated CEO in Colorado. So why should you care? Because most of his company's revenue comes from a single source, taxpayers. More than 2/3 of DaVita's revenue comes from Medicare and Medicaid payments, which is why the allegations you're about to hear about how DaVita has been billing the federal government are so alarming. If the allegations are true, the company threw away hundreds of millions of dollars of medicine, and you paid for it. It could be the largest case of Medicare fraud in U.S. history. Here's Drew Griffin.
That's good.
It was just by chance Dr. Alon Vayner, a medical director at dialysis clinics in Georgia, was discussing clinic procedures with one of the nurses, Daniel Barber, and the two say they saw something they believed was very wrong. Medicine, lots of it, was being tossed in the trash, and the clinic workers were being told to do it.
When we sat down and we started talking about it and getting into details, we actually realized exactly what's going on.
The alleged waste was being carried out on a massive scale, and the nurse and doctor say they knew almost immediately just why. They claim it was a way for their company, DaVita, to defraud the government, overbill Medicare and Medicaid, and make a fortune.
We're talking about a huge amount of money.
We're talking about in the hundreds of millions, easily, of the profits that this company reaped from those schemes, only from those two drugs. Hundreds of millions of dollars.
And because we're talking about defrauding Medicaid and Medicare, that's hundreds of millions that you, the taxpayer, pay for. Vayner and Barber say the alleged fraud schemes they discovered were going on at the company's clinics all across the country, more than 1,800 of them, with tens of thousands of patients. Multiply the numbers, the waste, and the billing. Dr. Alon Vayner says it was all a deliberate strategy.
Absolutely. It was just a scheme in order to fraudulently increase and maximize and boost the Medicare revenue, Medicare payments, so therefore fraudulently increase our revenue.
Here's how Dr. Vayner says DaVita instructed its nurses to administer a 100 milligram dose of iron called Venofer.
This is Venofer. It's iron.
And how much is this? I mean, how many?
That's 100 milligram. Okay. So, for example, if a patient would require this dose once per week, you'd administer 100 milligram, waste nothing, and charge Medicare for 100 milligram. What DaVita did, instead of this one vial, they gave 50 milligram out of this vial, residual, trash. 25, 75 to the trash. 25 again, 75 to the trash. So essentially, two whole vials. You have one vial that could have been given without waste.
The more vials DaVita used, the more DaVita was able to bill the government. Vayner and Barber claimed they tried to call attention to the massive waste and tried to get it stopped. But they say they were basically told to stop causing trouble themselves and continue following the company's protocols.
That's what upset me the most, and that's when I went to Dr. Vayner and I said, Dr. Vayner, I can do that.
Barber says he quit his job and left the clinic rather than continue where fraud was going on. Dr. Vayner claims the company punished him for speaking up.
Of course, once they found out, they did not renew my medical directorship or my practice. We are 3 physicians in our practice, and it was a significant loss of revenue.
Today, both men have filed a whistleblower lawsuit under the U.S. False Claims Act on behalf of the U.S. government, charging DaVita with massive Medicare fraud. They stand to make millions if DaVita is found guilty. DaVita's CEO wouldn't talk, but the company's attorney, Kim Rivera, did.
The allegation is pretty simple, that DaVita was being paid to throw away medicine and came up with schemes, as the plaintiffs call it, grids to maximize profits in terms of throwing away waste. What is DaVita's response?
Well, that's just wrong. If you look at the facts of the case, first of all, the doctors make dosing decisions. When you look at what the practices were, decisions were being made by doctors based on what was in the best interest of their patients. And they took into account a variety of things. You can't just look at one issue. You have to look at things like infection control, what the patient's going to do, how the patient's going to do with particular doses. And so during that entire time, what we did, what the doctors did, was appropriate.
But other companies, including DaVita's main competitor, used smaller vials, smaller combinations, limiting what was thrown away. DaVita only reiterated to us its decision to throw away medicine was for sound clinical reasons and never to increase wastage. Attorneys Lynn Wood and Marlon Wilbanks, who claim DaVita made as much as $800 million overbilling the government, say that defense won't hold up in court.
It's not just the taxpayers that are the victims here. It's the health care system.
It doesn't take a graduate degree to understand what's going on here. This is just dishonesty.
DaVita denies that and vows to fight this case in a Georgia court. But earlier this year in Texas, though denying it did anything wrong, DaVita settled a similar case for $55 million. Pat Burns with the watchdog group Taxpayers Against Fraud says the bigger problem is even if a company gets caught cheating the government, the company executives never seem to face any punishment. Fines are paid. Business continues as usual.
The way it's set up right now is if the fraud is not caught, then taxpayers foot the bill. If the fraud is caught, stockholders foot the bill.
Burns and others have been arguing for much harsher treatment when companies are found guilty of defrauding the federal government. He points to record billion-dollar fines, particularly in the pharmaceutical business, that are paid but executives don't get punished and the companies continue to do business with the government. In fact, one of DaVita's defenses to CNN is that the federal government itself has declined to charge the company with wrongdoing, even after reviewing the fraud allegations.
The government has come in and thoroughly investigated what the allegations are, and in both cases, the government decided to drop it and move on.
The U.S. attorney did decline to prosecute the case, but says the decision should not be construed as a statement about the merits of the case.
U.S. Department of Justice simply doesn't have the people.
Pat Burns says the short-staffed U.S. Department of Justice declines to join lawsuits all the time, instead allowing private citizens who hire private lawyers to essentially prosecute for the government, which brings us back to one doctor and one nurse who stand to make millions if those allegations of fraud are proven true. The biggest winners, though, in their lawsuit could be taxpayers. The U.S. government will recover the bulk of whatever they win. They and others like them are essentially the U.S. taxpayers' deputies in the fight against health care fraud.
Are you surprised that you guys have to defend the U.S. taxpayer? And not the U.S. government knocking on this door?
I'm not surprised. It's not easy to come forward and stand up and tell the truth, but it's the right thing to do.
their case set for trial later this year.
Drew Griffin joins us now. Drew, is there a chance DaVita just settles this case like the one they settled in Texas and then just put all these allegations behind them, continue to do business with the government?
You know, the attorney for DaVita couldn't rule that out, Wolf, but insists this time the company is going to fight the allegations. And as for continuing to do business with the government, that is the bread and butter of DaVita's $7 billion business. More than two-thirds of the company's revenue comes from treating patients on Medicare and Medicaid, so DaVita needs the government, Wolf, and will most likely do everything it can to make sure it has that contract in place so it keeps working.
Yet, even with all that money at stake, Drew, and so much fraud being alleged here, why isn't the government's own lawyers taking up the case? Is DaVita right in saying that is proof there is no case?
Well, it is a fair question to ask. Where are the government's lawyers? And I don't know the answer. The U.S. attorney here in Georgia would be the one to push this case. Congress has set aside more than $600 million specifically to prosecute health care fraud, but the U.S. attorney based in Atlanta has decided not to intervene. Does that mean that she thinks that this is a bad case? She wouldn't answer our calls. All we can tell you is, in a letter, the U.S. Attorney's Office stated its lack of prosecution should have no bearing on the merits of the case. And a reminder, Wolf, if these two guys win, the doctor and the nurse win, whatever settlement they do get, the biggest winner of that settlement is going to be the federal government.
Lost